Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlan Johnson, and let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. First, we have with us Mr. Todd McFarland, Associate General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, the President of the First Amendment Partnership, nonpartisan organization dedicated to protecting religious freedom for Americans of all faith. We have Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's the Assistant Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Dr. Timothy Golden, the professor at Walla University from the area of philosophy. Gentlemen, thank you and welcome to Faith and Politics. Let's just get into segment one. Segment one of the things that we hear a lot of people talking about is RFRA, regarding workplace and regarding activities there. But most of the world hears this and doesn't even really know what it means. So Tim, I'm gonna ask you, Schultz, if you could just give us a little bit of a background. What is RFRA and what's it all about?
Well, in 1990, the United States Supreme Court had decided a case called Employment Division versus Smith. It really gutted the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. There was outrage on the left, right, and center. And in response, Congress in 1993 nearly unanimously passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. That's what RFRA stands for. What RFRA means is that if the government causes a substantial burden to the religious exercise of an individual or a religious institution, they have to have a really good reason. They have to justify it with very compelling evidence, and they also have to do so showing that their solution is narrowly tailored toward the reason that they're doing the restriction on religion. It's a very important federal statute that protects people of all faiths. Studies show that it has protected minority religious faiths disproportionately, but it has become more controversial as some of the issues that it has dealt with have been the issues that have sounded in what we sometimes call the culture war.
So when we see this unpacking taking place of RFRA, and in particular, we see a lot of groups that are really pushing back, in particular the LGBTQ community and other quote-unquote minority groups. Is there some modifications that can take place as it relates to this, that maybe we still get what we're looking for in terms of protection from a religious perspective, but it gives a little bit more flexibility for those who may be feeling discrimination as well? Todd, what's your view on that?
You know, I don't think RFRA needs changed, right? RFRA was a bipartisan bill that was kept intentionally vague. It doesn't determine an outcome. It doesn't pick special categories. It just simply tries to replicate what was done in the First Amendment. The Supreme Court gutted. And, you know, we have a lot of provisions. You know, the First Amendment provides robust provisions, yet we've still been able to pass civil rights laws, and those, generally speaking, have been upheld. Now, there are certain limited circumstances where the First Amendment trumps civil rights legislation, for instance, hiring of pastors and firing them. It trumps that. However, in most other areas, it does not. And there's no reason to think that RFRA will be held any differently, and hasn't been. And so I think a lot of the accusations and criticisms of RFRA have really been uninformed. They've had to rely on false and misleading statements to make their arguments. And it just is more, I think, a headline issue than it is a real substantive issue when you dig into it.
But when you think about it, this legislation has been around for a while. We understand that obviously we have an evolution of our culture in our society. We have a change in the viewpoints. Politics is very different. Dr. Golden, is there something that we should be thinking about regarding RFRA to understand that it may have to evolve and we get out in front of it, potentially get that evolution moving in a direction that still protects individuals? What's your thoughts on that? Help me understand.
Yeah, I think we do have to think about RFRA very carefully. Tim Schultz just mentioned this really summed up very nicely the history of RFRA. And if I could just go back to the facts of Employment Division versus Smith, Employment Division of Human Resources of Oregon versus Smith, what's fascinating about that is that Smith was a member of a minority religion who smoked peyote as part of his religious beliefs. And the outcry over the Smith decision from left, right, and center, as Tim so nicely put it, was the fact that here you have this religious minority who is essentially left unprotected. And since then, what we've seen is that the RFRA that has been applied in the federal context has tended to protect people who might not have the religious profile of Mr. Smith. So as people who are members of sort of mainstream evangelical Christian faiths, I'm thinking of the Hobby Lobby decision from about 8 years ago.
Right.
So
right.
I think we have to get back in touch with the roots of Smith if RFRA is going to really have any robust application.
Well, Dr. Brown, and I know you don't know anything about smoking peyote or anything along those lines, but there has to be a line drawn in the sand somewhere, right? We can't just simply allow anyone that wants to tack religion on themselves for protection, or is that what we really are trying to do? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's very troubling if you look at how people who have no religious compunction whatsoever have shown a very tremendous willingness to seize upon a quote unquote religious exemption to not do something that they don't want to do. So I think the bigger issue is that, and nobody has the market cornered on this. The bigger issue is there are too many people who are willing to get rid of something that makes sense in order to get something that doesn't make sense. And I think until that is recognized as a problem and addressed from a larger context, good luck working our way through this one.
So Todd, but that's a good point. How do we get to a point where RFRA is actually really protecting someone's religious beliefs as opposed to people just utilizing this to protect what they feel like, what they're comfortable with? How do we make sure that's not what's really happening? And is there something we should think about from a modification standpoint?
To answer your last question is no. I think RFRA is, as it stands, a good law, and it's been in place since the early 90s and does not need modified. You know, the issues that Lawrence Brown raised, which about, a lack of sincerity, courts already deal with that, right? So again, it's important to say RFRA does not determine outcome. It simply gives a process and the balancing, and the line drawing is left to courts, which is what courts do, especially when it comes to the First Amendment. And a lot of the sort of outrageous cases where people have made claims in RFRA, especially in the corrections context, courts balance those all the time. And so I do think that there does need to be line drawing, but the whole point of a First Amendment and a RFRA style is not to subject it to the democratic process, but rather to give people protections, even when those protections are not politically powerful. And you mentioned the Hobby Lobby situation. Again, first of all, that was a rule that was not put in by Congress. It was put in by a Democratic administration, right? The contraception mandate. Mm-hmm. And second, the Supreme Court didn't say that they couldn't provide contraception. They simply said they couldn't force an employer to do that where they had an objection to it. And there was other ways of doing that. So I think the line drawing is an appropriate thing to do, but just the idea to gut this bill, which is what I think we're going to talk about this later, certain legislative suggestions have been, is not the correct answer.
I just want to add, I think it's important to realize that most RFRA cases lose. Okay, there's a lot of academic literature on this. People can make claims, but most of the claims actually are unsuccessful. And of course, the other thing, as Todd alluded to, is that RFRA only protects sincerely held religious beliefs. And there are a lot of insincere beliefs where people try to claim religious beliefs that are flimsy, but they have to be religious beliefs. They can't just be philosophical beliefs. So I think that built into the structure of RFRA are some of the protections against abuse. And again, if you take a really objective look at the academic literature on this, I think that you could make a pretty strong argument that RFRA is sort of underprotective, not overprotective.
Dr. Golder, I'm going to give you the last word on this. The idea that there is someone like the courts that's testing my sincerity, that's letting me know if it's really a religious belief. Are you comfortable with that, or is this where we really want to see our country going?
Well, courts have to have some workable standard. They have to have some way to measure the legitimacy of someone's claims. And that question has typically turned on sincerity. While we don't want governmental probing into matters of conscience, we do need to have some way to measure whether or not someone's belief is legitimate. And so we have to strike that balance under the law, and I think that's what courts try to do.
I'm going to have to let that be the last word on that, gentlemen. I know we could talk about this for a while, but let's move on. We're going to go to segment 2. Segment 2 is talking about how we deal with issues, in particular one that's called the no harm act. How do you do no harm? How do you do that in a way where you preserve somebody's right to protect their religious freedom, but also not going too far and putting ourselves in a position where now starting to infringe upon separation of church and state? Dr. Golden, I'm going to ask you to kind of give us the framework of this do no harm concept.
Well, I think the Do No Harm Act is intended to clarify state RFRAs in terms of preventing churches or religious groups from using religion as a pretext to discriminate against people. And if I could just pick up on something Todd said in the last segment, Todd was right in that there's a danger of over legislating. And I see the Do No Harm Act as an intervention from people on the political left that are overly concerned about trying to curtail or control how RFRA is used. I understand their concern, but I think this is a case of over legislating.
So, Dr. Brown, it sounds like Dr. Golden says we got a little bit of overreach with this legislation here, that we had something in place, and this looks like somebody's coming in and trying to tighten the noose a little bit more. Do you agree with him? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you had to know the country was going this direction. I mean, when I was a kid, I remember watching different debates, folks on different sides, and they really were trying to deal with the issues. Today, you don't get that sense. You don't get the sense that people are arguing issues. You get the sense that people are trying to protect their partisan position at any cost. And that's a problem. And so people trying to overdo it, it's something that we've been doing for the last few years anyway. So I would tend to agree that this is just another example of folks, instead of focusing on what we need to do to get everybody to a better place, we have people focusing on what they need to do to protect their base.
Tim Schultz, what do you think about that?
Well, I agree with Dr. Golden that this is overreach. I mean, I think this Do No Harm Act is based upon the idea that RFRA cannot impinge on third parties. If you exercise your religion, great, but if you impinge on any third parties, the problem with that is pretty much all legitimate exercises of religious freedom inevitably impinge on third parties. Take the case of the church that opens up a halfway house or a prisoner reentry program, and the neighbors object, right? And the church says, well, we want to do this. And the neighbors say, well, we don't want a concentration of ex-offenders in our neighborhood. Well, there's a plausible third party harm there. The Do No Harm Act would say, well, the religious freedom claim loses there. I mean, there's nothing more of a third party harm than when we give somebody the ability to conscientiously object from serving in the military because somebody else has to go in your place, right? So that's a third party harm. So I think the problem is that if you import this idea of third party harm into the law and into RFRA, you're basically saying that the only time religious freedom claims will ever win is if they aren't very consequential because they don't impact anybody else. And I think that's a very dangerous idea. It seems plausible on the surface. We don't want to hurt third parties. But I think in practice, it proves to be something that more or less guts the whole rule of religious freedom.
So, Todd, it sounds like what we got here, we got belts and suspenders. We got the Do No Harm Act, and we also have RFRA. So if that's the case, is there a possibility that we're going to find groups that are just ignoring one or the other, or is this just creating more confusion?
Oh, no. I mean, well, first of all, they can ignore what they want. But I mean, if they change federal law, I mean, presumably judges will follow it. No, but I think Tim was right. I mean, the whole, you can find a, quote, third party harm wherever you want. And it's really just another way of saying, I don't want this particular law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, to apply to my circumstance. Because, you can take a situation, for instance, where a church is hiring an employee.
Right.
You can say, well, this has a harm on the employees. Well, yeah, but, shouldn't churches have the right to hire people? In fact, generally speaking, in this country, we allow employers to decide who to hire, right? And we had put some limits on that and said certain protected categories should, you can't make a determination there because we deem them to be not related to the employment. But for in churches and religious employers, they are, right? And so, again, I think this idea that it shouldn't have impact with third people, it really, you're always, no person is an island, right? And so you can always find this if you're looking for it. And in fact, people bringing these claims are wanting to have a third party impact, right, on the organizations and their members. So it really just, I think, is just another way of saying we want to win.
But Dr. Brown, we're in a society now where it's ever changing. It's evolving from place to place. We've got new legislation that's coming in all the time because it's either legislation from the left or legislation from the right. Churches sometimes have a reputation of being not fair at what they do. So as a result, sometimes the government comes in and says, because you won't do it the right way, we've got to come in and do it for you. Isn't that what's happening here? Somebody else is coming in saying that maybe the churches aren't playing fair and maybe they're not going down the right road. What's your thoughts on that? Help me understand.
Well, I do believe that how charged the environment is today, that you frequently find people who are not so much speaking about what's going to be in somebody's best interest as they are speaking from their own faith perspective, which to a certain extent, I don't have a problem with that. But where I do start to have a problem with it is when what we're doing is not engaging the underlying principle that Christ told us. And the whole idea of Jesus asking us to love our neighbor and to do unto others, that's getting lost in the discussion. It's no longer about what's going to be, how I can be loving and how I can be fair-minded, but it's all about, this dogmatic approach that frequently doesn't get us to a better place.
Well, I think what we are is there was a time where we'd hear people talk about there's not a red state, there's not a blue state. But we talk about purple states now all the time. The fact of the matter is everything is so intermingled, how do we even know where we want to do? But the question is will we ever see another potential bipartisan piece of legislation like RFRA, or are we probably in a situation right now where RFRA is as good as it's going to get, so we probably just need to keep our hands off of it? Dr. Golden, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, bipartisan legislative achievements are very rare, and RFRA, I think, is one of those rare achievements. I'm not optimistic about how many more of those achievements are in our immediate future. I would like to see several of them come to pass, but it's unlikely to happen. So I guess you could say I'm cautiously pessimistic instead of cautiously optimistic.
Tim Schultz, I'm going to give you the last word on this. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, in the last administration, there was a major achievement on criminal justice reform. We have seen people on the conservative right become more interested in these issues, and it's led by faith groups. And so I think that what we need, if we're going to see bipartisan legislation, for instance, in the area of LGBT rights and religious freedom, it will have to involve faith groups that are seen as somewhat on the center right, really engaging and persuading lawmakers that are on the center right that these are issues that they ought to be addressing too.
Great. Well, gentlemen, thank you for that. And let's move on to our last segment. Our segment now is talking about the Maine's Assistant Tuition Program. We're starting to see a lot of cases come up where you have states that are in the process of providing funds to engage in different activities. And then all of a sudden there's a question, well, if you're a religious school, if you're a religious organization, that these public funds that may be available may no longer be available for you. Todd, can you help us to kind of unpack a little bit of what this particular case was with Maine and why the Supreme Court thought it was important to even engage in it in some way?
Sure. So I think as most people watching this know, and at least in America, and if you're watching this overseas, Maine is a very small but rural state up in the northeast part of the country. In fact, the most north and most east part of the country. And as a result of that, there are certain parts of the state where there isn't necessarily a public school district close by. And so what Maine said is, well, if there's not a public school district available, we will pay for you to go to private school. But they put a caveat, it couldn't be a religious private school. And so the question is that constitutional? States obviously do not have to pay for people to go to a private school. They provide public education instead. But where it makes, just quite frankly, economic sense for the state to pay for private education, can they exclude schools solely because it is religious? And we don't have a decision on the case yet, but based upon the oral argument, it seems pretty likely that the Supreme Court, at least some of the justices, are going to say that the state can't do that.
Dr. Brown, what do you think about that? I was thinking about when you and I were in New York growing up, we went to private schools and we actually had school buses that were basically part of the public school system that took us back and forth to school. What do we see going on here? Is the world changing, or should we be looking at this a little bit differently, that it's a lot more stiff-arming than actually helping people?
Well, this whole discussion, I find it very interesting because even as a kid, my father had very strong feelings about this, and he worried that if the government was paying for church school, that it might give them some leverage in ways that he wasn't comfortable with them having. Here's the reality situation. You look at Maine, they've got a real situation. It's a small state, it's a rural state, and there are places where there just isn't a readily available public school. I do think, and as they pointed out, this matter hasn't been decided yet, but I do think that this is an area where we have to somehow pray for wisdom. And I'm listen, forgive me, folks, but I don't think they do a lot of praying for wisdom in Washington these days. But if they can somehow pray for some wisdom here so that they can make some meaningful adjustments and not just slice it all one way or slice it all the other way,
right,
so that at the end of the day, the problem gets solved without creating some other problems. That's what we can at least hope for.
But Dr. Golden, we're talking about Maine being a small state. What if the Supreme Court ends up making a decision? We may start seeing medium states that decide that this makes sense for them. And when you are a taxpayer, and I believe even if you're generally a part of a religious body, you probably still do pay taxes, that the ability to have some of those funds come to benefit you that somehow may have a slight religious connection should not be that big a deal, or am I missing something? Help me understand.
Well, my concern here, well, first of all, I think the trend is clear. If the court follows the Espinoza decision from last year, which I expect that it will, there may be some subtle distinctions between the two. I think they're going to strike down the restrictions in Maine on public money for private religious education. My concern is for people in church communities and Christian communities, because I'm left wondering, to what extent does the receipt of government money to fund the religious mission of your school compromise your integrity as a faith community? In what sense do you, as a member of a faith community, still feel obligated or motivated to support your own faith-based endeavor when someone else is paying the bills for you?
Well,
So
Tim Schultz, let me jump in with you on this. So if this is where we're going, with the idea that we've got to be really concerned about what's going on, but school is spending a whole lot of time engaging in activities that have nothing to do with religion. So the fact that you've got these funds that come in and help that component, doesn't that make sense to some degree? Help me understand this.
Well, two things, right? I think I agree with Dr. Golden that you want to be careful here. I think, though, that if you have a student going to a Christian college who's using a Pell Grant, that's taxpayer money.
Yep.
I don't think that really ends up compromising either the institution or the government. I think that there are instances where it can compromise, but I think we need to remember the history here. A lot of this goes back to the before the 20th century, the 19th century, and the work of James Blaine, who was a very powerful member of Congress and a bigot. He hated immigrants, most of whom were Catholic. There was an attempt to try to make it so Catholic schools, which were then primarily being used by new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe,
right,
were not able to ever really participate in the public square. And so there is this history here that the Supreme Court has noted most recently in the Espinoza case, as Dr. Golden mentioned, that's a really, really bad history that ought to be shameful that people are still relying on 19th century anti-immigrant bigotry to use. Now, how we draw the lines is a separate question, but I do think it's important to understand that really bad history.
So, Dr. Brown, when we look at where this is going and we start to realize that now every decision we see is partisan, we'd like to say that there's some way we're going to do something from a nonpartisan standpoint. Where do you feel this is going to be moving? I mean, we're talking about Maine, which is actually just a few states up from New York. I mean, is this something that maybe you have a concern that the Northeast may start to see some of that come into play? What's your thoughts on that? Help me understand that one.
Well, with both Tims and with some of the concerns that Todd raised, I just feel as though this is one of those situations where you got to hope that somewhere along the line, we're going to take some smart pills or drink some holy water or just do something that removes the madness that is in charge of our governing right now. Because too much of what's happening is not driven by a desire to just work things out for people. And that's troubling. That's what government is supposed to be about. And it annoys me to no end that in Washington, they can get so deadlocked that the things we sent them there to do just don't get done. Folks, it's not that hard. Everyone agree. We're not going to use every other word that you say in an attack political ad. Everyone agree. We're going to focus on getting some stuff done. And then you'll be shocked and surprised how much you can get done when it becomes about getting stuff done as opposed to sniping at each other and protecting territory. And the madness has to stop.
Todd,
it may not, but it has to.
Todd, I'm going to give you the last word on this. So as we look at this, there clearly should be some things where there's some funding that ends up ending in institutions that may have a religious connection. But I just want to know, what do you think about this? Where do you think the happy medium is in wrapping this all up?
I think, it's what I think the Supreme Court has said in a couple of the other cases, including cases like Trinity Lutheran, which is, listen, government doesn't have to throw money into a particular area, but if they do, they can't discriminate and they can't exclude areas of faith. And the reason for that is, remember, churches ran schools well before government did, right? In the space well before. Once the government comes in and starts throwing billions and billions of dollars into an area, they just have the ability to displace it. And so then simply saying that the government can, just put tons of money into a space and then can just shove religion out, I think is problematic, especially in a situation like Maine, where they basically decided to outsource part of their, obligation under their state constitution, and that is to provide an education. Parents aren't forced to send their kids to a private school or religious school, but if they're given the option of private school, they need to be given the option of private religious school.
Well, we're going to have to end it right there, but I appreciate that conversation. We're going to move on to our last segment of Tell Me Something I Don't Know. Gentlemen, I'd like for you to just take a few seconds and tell me something that I don't know. I'm going to start with you, Todd. Tell me something I don't know, Todd.
I will tell you this: the state of Washington recently agreed to an injunctive relief in their adoption programs that is designed to say they cannot exclude people because of the religious beliefs they hold from participating in the foster care program and adoption program the states have. Wow,
that's a good one. Dr. Brown, tell me something I don't know.
Hey, you may know this, but I think a lot of people don't realize that the whole concept of mandates is nothing new. It's something this country for a long time has had to deal with. And I just wish people would go back and look at their history a little bit before they start talking as though the world is about to end because a mandate has been handed down.
Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Well, we've decried the dysfunction in Washington, D.C., the lack of problem solving, and that's all true. There is, however, a lot of problem solving happening at the municipal, local, state level. And so if you want to find examples of good government, people solving problems, look more locally, and perhaps we ought to concentrate more power there rather than the place that's most dysfunctional.
Tim Golden, we're going to end with you. Tell me something I don't know.
Get ready for World War III in state legislatures all across the country, because in June, Roe versus Wade will die.
Wow. That's a big one there. Well, listen, thanks a lot, gentlemen. Appreciate you being here with us. And we're going to hopefully find ourselves in a position where we're making things to move to the right direction politically. Thanks. Well, that was our show, Faith and Politics. We want to thank you for being with us. We just simply want you to know that if it's about government and if it's about God, then it's always going to be about faith and politics. See you next week.